In 2,300 pages, the biggest overhaul of our financial system since the 1930s. But does financial reform, the new law of the land, make the structural changes needed to prevent another near collapse of the entire system? Here to discuss, Dick Parsons, chairman of Citigroup and former chairman and CEO of our parent company, Time Warner, and Alan Schwartz, executive chairman of Guggenheim Partners and formerly the CEO of Bear Stearns. Thank you guys both for being here. I appreciate it. First to you, Alan, do you think financial reform, we have it, like it or not, did it address the right issues? Did lawmakers get it right?
Well, I would say a couple things. One, I think it does address the right issues, most of the right issues, and it's going in the right direction. I think the key going forward is there's still an awful lot of this that we don't know. There was a debate as to whether to have laws that were very rigid and said, here are the new rules, and then worry about what happens over the next, number of years when things change and whether those laws will still be relevant, or whether to give regulators new authority and ask them to create rules and stay on top of those rules as the world evolves. They went for the latter, which I think is the right approach, but what it says is we really don't yet know what the new rules are going to specifically be in a lot of key areas.
We only know what some of the rules, few have taken effect. It's going to be years before we have the full implementation. Do you think, Dick, as the head of a big global bank that is still part government-owned, does FinReg go far enough to curb that excessive risk-taking that we saw and that we heard so much about in the debate about this bill and where it should go?
Well, it won't surprise you. I agree with Alan. In that the direction is right, although it's too early to tell what the impact will be. I would have a lot more confidence answering in the affirmative a question as, did this bill get it right to prevent exactly what happened last time? Then does this bill create a regulatory paradigm that will keep something that none of us can really identify right now from happening in the future?
But you've talked about, and Dick, you said this when we spoke about a year and a half ago, before financial reform, that human nature can never be modeled in. So don't we face that risk now?
Yeah, if you would ask me, will there never be another crisis in the financial arena, I'd say no. I mean, of course there will, because we can't regulate the nature of the beast out of the beast.
The Volcker rule, essentially supporting a return of Glass-Steagall, it was softened a lot. Would you, Alan, have supported a return to Glass-Steagall?
No, I don't. I think that the United States is probably the only place where there was a Glass-Steagall before it was repealed. So I'm not sure if you think about harmonizing international standards and you have banks around the world who are in both, and all of a sudden only the U.S. has those powers separated. No, I don't think you can go all the way back there. I think the Volcker rule, it isn't really going back to Glass-Steagall in the first place. The Volcker rule is more about saying if we recognize that very large institutions have some sort of implicit subsidy to their cost of capital, should they be allowed to put that into more speculative type things as is being defined by the Volcker rule? I think there's an offsetting pushback to that, which is actually if you look at companies that got into a lot of trouble, a lot of them were monolines. That if you restrict the types of businesses that somebody can be in, they almost definitely are going to go over the top. If all I do is lend to commercial real estate, it's going to be very hard for me to avoid having a big exposure to commercial real estate. And the diversification that comes from some of the things that the Volcker rule will separate out might be a positive. So it's a touchy subject, in my opinion.
If we had financial reform at the beginning of 2008, do you think that Bear Stearns would have gone under?
That's a good question. I think the answer is probably not. When it did. I don't know whether the financial reform we have now would have handled what happened in the fall of 2008. But I think that a big part of what happened at Bear Stearns, a big part of what happened in the fall of 2008 was about the complete lack of transparency of balance sheets. People have summed it all up as risk-taking, but there were very different levels of risk-taking in a variety of different financial institutions. The problem is from the outside, because a lot of these instruments were not traded anywhere and were not didn't have any, ability to have price lookup. There was no way of knowing what was on every particular institution's balance sheet.
But I do wonder, and to you, Dick, on this, how much transparency there will be going forward. We've already seen Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, other banks surely to follow, spinning off their internal hedge funds into separate entities. So it almost seems as though we may not know all of the activity going on now. They won't create the risk that they did before to those banks because they are separate, but still, we're seeing moves in that direction.
Well, I mean, this is the direct fallout of the so-called Volcker rule, to push a lot of stuff off balance sheet out of large regulated depository institutions. And one of the concerns has been from the beginning, what happens to the so-called shadow banking system? I mean, do you really just take risky activities and move them out into an area that has no light still to be shined on?
Is that what's happening?
Again, too early to say. Clearly, some of the things, at Citi, for example, our CEO has been very adamant, was one of the early supporters of modification of the Volcker rule, that, banks should return to banking. Trading on your own account shouldn't be a sort of fundamental banking proposition. So we pushed some of that out, but is that going to be a wholesale march, and is the shadow banking system going to, in essence, get sufficient size and scale to really be systemically threatening? I don't know.
The flaw was when you got underneath the first crisis, you were totally reliant on ratings to figure out what anybody owned. And once the ratings were no longer accepted as being relevant, there was no other way to develop transparency. And I'll just say this, in the new bill, I think the most important thing they're doing is, at least in an attempt to move in a direction, is moving as much as possible onto exchanges and clearinghouses. Sure. And so the earlier question you asked me about what happened with Bear Stearns, the problem that we had with investment banks lacking a discount window or a lender of last resort is that even if you had good collateral to borrow against, there was just a run on the banks, not knowing what was on those balance sheets. So that part of this, I think, is being covered by this bill of saying, let's move as much of that stuff onto exchanges where you can get much more transparency as to how everybody is doing.
Can I just interject for a minute, though, because this goes back to the point you and I were talking about a minute ago about the nature of the beast, right? You're 100% right that the move was to get potentially risky assets off bank balance sheets and out to a broader sort of investing public. We did it through securitizations and various derivative forms, and by so doing, attenuate, mitigate, maybe even eliminate the risks that were inherent. But to me, this was entirely a repeat of the thrift crisis of the late 80s and early 90s, which at the root of which was a belief that, first of all, a drive for home ownership, right? Which is a fundamental thing, almost like a right in America. Everyone ought to be entitled to a home. The legislators, even the regulators, sort of promoted it. The banks went out, and people just made risky loans. Now, what securitization and derivatization enabled was for the poison to be spread a lot more.
But aren't the rating agencies, Dick, at the crux of spreading the poison, and they're not addressed at all in reform?
The crux was the underlying bad credits. And so, regulating around the seed, which was the belief that you can lend people money who have no ability to repay, and that housing prices always go up and will take you out of your bad loans. That's the crux.